This video is a response to a recent video from Charlie of the channel Our Changing Climate called The American Military is Polluting the World. I'd recommend you check out his video on the subject first, as well as his video The True Cost of the Military-Industrial Complex, before watching this, as he explains the argument I'm about to lay out here. Also, subscribe to his channel. He makes amazing content, and if you like me, you'll love him. Anyway, in this slightly under 50-second video, Charlie explains how the U.S. military is a bigger contributor to climate change than several other countries, and how the money that the U.S. pumps into the military-industrial complex, that in turn goes into equipment that pollutes the air and water of the communities surrounding it. And he ends the video by stating the abolition of the American military is vital to securing, quote, a zero-carbon world. While I admittedly have flirted with the idea of abolishing the military before, it is not an idea that I have thought through deeply. While I have always been in support of cutting our gargantuan military budgets, that we could cut in half and still have by far and away the biggest military on the globe, and I have before on this channel pointed out the hypocrisy amongst politicians for claiming to want to fight climate change while simultaneously supporting beefing up the already bloated military budget year after year, I never really gave too much thought to the idea of abolition, even though I had considered doing so several times throughout the past couple of years. Despite the seemingly, quote, radical nature one might perceive regarding the issue of military abolition, even many of the founding fathers were against the idea of a standing army. For instance, George Washington called it, quote, a dangerous instrument to play with. James Madison says, quote, a standing army is one of the greatest mischiefs that can possibly happen. And Thomas Jefferson said, quote, none but an armed nation can dispense with a standing army. Many of these quotes are in the founders' support for well-regulated militias under the Second Amendment. Of course, this fact has to be married with the fact that founding father and second President John Adams created a standing army, but it should be noted that this action alienated many of his contemporaries. Obviously, times have changed dramatically since the era of the nation's founding. However, calls for abolition have persisted. One proponent is Greg Schupak, author and professor of media studies at Ontario's University of Guelph, who wrote an article in Jacobin detailing his support for abolition. He includes in his reasoning the damage to the environment the military was responsible for, as well as other reasons, including its breeding of right-wing extremists and the disaster it poses to humanitarianism around the world. Perhaps the greatest first-hand example of what happens when a country abolishes its military is Costa Rica, which abolished its armed forces in the late 1940s after their civil war. By doing so, they were able to reallocate funds to social programs that materially benefited the general populace, including healthcare and education. In the decades following the abolition, the country has seen new hospitals and schools built, as well as a near-unanimous literacy rate and one of the lowest infant mortality rates on the planet. However, Costa Rica and the U.S. are dramatically different countries, and this video is not attempting to answer the question, should the U.S. abolish the military? Rather, it is to provide some pieces of evidence to take in when considering this issue. However, I can give at least 3 common-sense solutions that would dramatically shrink our military, and as a result, its rampant pollution. Number 1. Cut the budget. This is pretty self-explanatory. Like I mentioned earlier, as Charlie has said, we can slash the military budget by 50% and still have the biggest military in the world. And despite politicians like Bernie Sanders supporting these efforts, so far the general consensus in Washington is that we need to keep beefing it up every year, with a refusal to even accept a mere 10% cut, a drop in the bucket when looking at the big picture. Climate activists must include cutting the military budget substantially in their demands and protests. Number 2, close foreign military bases. There is no reason for the U.S. to have more than 10 times the amount of foreign bases as all other countries combined. Given the amount of CO2 these combined bases emit, closing these bases is not only an anti-imperialism issue, it is also an environmentalism issue. And finally, number 3, no more sanctions. We've all heard progressives say end the wars a million times, but that's not enough. We need to end U.S.-imposed sanctions that have crippled foreign countries. However, just like with cutting the military budget, that doesn't seem likely anytime soon. As of just earlier this week, House Democrats are preparing to force a vote on a defense bill to provide security assistance to Ukraine, which would also impose new sanctions on Russia. This despite the fact that Ukrainian officials have denied the imminence of a Russian invasion. Additionally, as administration officials for President Biden have said, quote, the sanctions could have major impacts on Russian consumers, industrial operations, and employment, and would in some instances put Russia in the same restrictive group of countries for export control purposes as Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria, end quote. Given the devastating impacts these sanctions have had on the economies of these aforementioned countries, imposing them on another nuclear power like Russia would only exacerbate tensions and increase the chances of war. In the end, every environmentalist should agree that we must at the very least drastically shrink the size of our military. However, the debate as to whether to abolish the military is one worth having, and creators like Charlie of Our Changing Climate can help add information to further it. And you've come to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe. Click the button on the left to watch related videos, or click the box on the right to watch my latest video. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and if you really like what I do, support the channel on Patreon. The links are all in the description below, and I will see everybody on Tuesday.